this event with the School of Public Policy. Andres Velasco, the dean, couldn't be here, but we have Luis Garicano and a few other members of the faculty here with us for this joint event. Extremely happy to have with us John Williams. John is a dear old friend for many, many years. My very first paper as a graduate student, John was my discussant of my very first paper many, many years ago. So he was very kind to a poor graduate student who didn't know what he was doing. But more importantly, John did his PhD at Stanford and was for many years president of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco before moving to his current job at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where he is both the president of the bank as well as permanent member of the FOMC. That's the main monetary policy decisions in the U.S. Of as much, John is an ideal guest for the topic that we have today because he both had at San Francisco Fed as an economist for many years, an extremely distinguished career as an academic economist. He has really seminal contributions to many parts of economics, starting in growth till then monetary policy. But as well as through the San Francisco Fed and now the Federal Reserve Bank of New York has been a very engaged policymaker at the center of many of the key decisions in the last few years. So he's really traveled the two worlds in many ways.
You left out the most important thing.
Having said that, the most important thing, last word, is that John is an MSc from the Economics Department from 1989. So those are the master students with us. There's hope. For those of you suffering through the end of your master's, this is where you can ambition to be. With that in mind, we're going to get started. We decided to organize as a conversation as opposed to prepared remarks. And so we're going to have a chat about connecting academics to policy between two of us. We're going to be speaking for about 40-ish minutes, 40-ish minutes, and then I'll open the conversation becomes broader and I'll call on people to answer questions as well. So I will start certainly with giving you a chance at a broader sense of last 3 years, extremely challenging times for monetary policy. It's almost embarrassing to think about the topics that we were discussing 3 years ago or 4 years ago relative to what reality turned out to be, but who saw COVID coming, who saw the supply chain disruptions, everything that's happened to inflation. If you were to look back and at some of these challenges, how would you say that exactly academics were helpful at different stages at the different turning points of these last 3 years? Looking back, we'll talk more about the present now, but just looking back in the last few years, what way was academic work important?
Well, I think it's absolutely critically important in everything we do. I mean, I always tell people that, speaking from the FOMC, kind of my experience at the FOMC, at the policy table, the distance between economic research in terms of time and kind of the ideas and the actual discussions of policymakers and staffs who advise policymakers is remarkably short. And that's a good thing. So, we often are talking about working papers that aren't even published or research that's, very in early days. So that's a very important thing about trying to understand the world around us, how it's changing, and how to better think about how the economy is behaving, the financial system, and how monetary policy fits into that. During the pandemic period, and since it was even 10 times so. There were so many things that were happening that were not just kind of fitting into maybe our standard DSG models. By the way, I will defend DSG models. I know they get criticized a lot. Yeah, they get criticized a lot. But those models do, I personally think, along with a lot of other models, are very helpful for thinking about certain issues. But the pandemic just brought a range of shocks and dynamics that you don't normally see at least in the U.S. business cycle. First of all, the pandemic, the health crisis, but also massive fiscal stimulus. We have Russia's war in Ukraine, so a lot of things coming in that were 2, 3, 4 standard deviations. So I think that the research matters a lot because it helps us organize the data, organize the observations and how we put them together. It's also really important in how we communicate with each other and debate ideas. One powerful thing in economics is that we write down what we think and you put it down in equations or you put it down in your statistical analysis, and people can respond to that and come up with a different model, a different approach, or a different analysis and have that debate. And that was very much happening in real time. We didn't get it all right, and I'm sure we'll come back to that, but it definitely was powerful, especially, I would say especially because, there's a tendency for all of us to go back to some, kind of basic models we know, and whether it's a DSG model or whatever, whatever your favorite Phillips curve or whatever. And those are helpful and those were, valuable. But this was a situation where we really wanted to get more information than that. So we used a lot of granular disaggregated data, a lot of high frequency data, a lot of, things that are now available regularly that help you see what's happening across sectionally and also at more high frequency to see how things were changing, especially in 2020, 2021. I will say one thing that we did a lot of work on, and a lot of people did that didn't pay off, was these epidemiological models and trying to apply those to macro. It was just one of those things. It was, of course, we all did this. We were trying to forecast what was going on with the pandemic and how does that fit into our models. And I think it was something that it was good to have tried. It didn't end up doing as much help as you might wish.
But let me going a little something you said just a couple of minutes ago, which is nobody could have seen a pandemic coming, of course. But it's often when you get this unexpected shocks that you go and remember something you learned in school at the LSE or some very key mechanism that turns out to have been really important that you didn't appreciate before in some ways. That there's a particular point about transmission of shocks, where shocks can come from, how monetary policy works. If you were to highlight one for us here, so if I were to teach the new John Williams when I walk into the class tomorrow, in what sense will the pandemic says, I should do a little bit more of this kind of model? We obviously had that with the financial crisis where you all started doing a lot more financial frictions in macro. Right. What would you see? You've already said it's not the epi macro models, fine, but let's be positive. What would be the one thing that you would change the curriculum and say we should spend a little more weeks teaching?
I don't know if it's more teaching. I go back to having a really rich kind of experience here at LSE, but also, when I did my PhD at Stanford. And I think what was really valuable was understanding different ways of thinking about the macro, how to think about macro. And I grew up in this, ancient era of real business cycle theory. And we all have our views on RBC theory and stuff, but it actually was very important because it dealt with supply shocks a lot. And at the time people were arguing, well, are productivity shocks that important or something? Well, when you're in a pandemic, clearly we're getting supply shocks, demand shocks, and lots of other in government shutdown. And so that training and thinking about kind of, both from I think, kind of a new Keynesian kind of approach, but also having that, grounding in production, technology and preferences, having that grounding too is very important. So having both of those, not being in kind of one camp or the other, and seeing that, I go back to, I had Chris Pissarides for macro, and way back then, early days of thinking about beverage curves and surge theory and stuff. Those are the tools that, you never know when those tools are suddenly going to be relevant. In the last couple of years, it's been like the top 3 issue of understanding what's going on in the labor market, as it was in the recovery last time. So to me, I always go back to my education and think about what's important is you are planting a tree that's going to bear fruit in all different types of situations. So having, the richest experience, not just on one thing, but having, seen it from different perspectives. And I was very fortunate to have had that. Because I had both Chris and Richard Layard, which are different views of macro, but extremely helpful.
Good. And then you were mentioning the fact that during the pandemic in the last few years, you've had an explosion of new data associated both with our ability to collect better data, information, as well as just computing power in some ways. So we've had that tree growing. At the same time, you need some theory to organize it. Do you think that, from your perspective, common question in science, is data ahead of theory, or is theory ahead of data in that sense? Did you feel like you had more data that you could make sense of because you didn't have the theoretical apparatus, or the other way around? You had more theoretical questions for which the actual real data that you really wanted wasn't there?
Well, I think that those two feed each other. I go back to the financial crisis, and as you mentioned, macro had kind of abandoned financial frictions in a way. And we had, back 40 years ago, a lot of macro models focused on the balance sheets of the financial system and the global, balance sheets in terms of, and we got away from that, got away from quantities and focused primarily on prices, right? Equity, prices and interest rates and things like that. But pretty quickly, with the realization of the financial crisis, what happened with the financial crisis, economists started bringing those frictions back. I mean, we had some basis for that from earlier research on that, and so I think that the experience can tell people we got to find data and use that data and then develop theories that help with that. So from my perspective, I have not felt that we had too much data. I felt that often, as a time series macro person, the thing that's been most illuminating is I would say most of the data and most of the interesting information we're getting is not really time series anymore. It's much more cross-sectional. It's much more like if you're trying to understand what's happening in the Phillips curve or labor markets, just looking at you only have so many cycles, you only have so much information. And so you're either looking at it, across firms or across space or across countries or something. And you can use that disaggregated data and microdata to help on that. So I think that for me, the thing that has really really grown is ability to bring in kind of the microdata into thinking about some of the macro issues. As a monetary policymaker, I mean, I always think that the problem we're trying to solve is, first, number one, where is the economy now? It's like things like an obvious thing. Well, GDP is this. Well, no, like understand what's the state of the economy today in terms of whether it's employment, income, inflation, wages, all the things that we think matter, and filter the data to get the signal of that. And you might think of it in terms of an output gap or something, but whatever it is like, here's how I understand where the economy is today. The second question you ask is, where is the economy likely to go? And the third one is, how do you adjust monetary policy in order to get the outcome that you wanted, given that? And I think a lot of this, the micro data and the disaggregated data, are really helpful in that first question. They may not help you much on the second question about what's likely the next 3 years of growth, but they give you a much better reading on kind of where the current state of the economy is. Like right now, we're looking at all this micro data on rents. We're not just waiting for the BLS to tell us, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, to tell us what the inflation rate was last month. We're not waiting for that. We're looking at the real-time data that comes from companies like Zillow and things. And similarly, looking at job vacancies, there's Indeed and other companies who are doing that. So it's a very different world now, where you get a lot more information about where the current state is.
So let's turn to, exactly as you mentioned, rents to the inflation. Let's start going a little bit back in a couple of years and then move to the present. Inflation went up a lot, and you have an inflation target of 2%, and this is obviously the big concern and a big loss in 2021. If you look back now with the data we have now, I'm not saying at the time we can argue and agree and disagree on whether you did the right policy or not, but looking now 2 or 3 years later, if you were to point to what you think were the main causes for why inflation went up so much, and even if you want to boldly venture some quantification, because the answer is going to be what caused, what would you say were the reasons why it went up? Now, again, with a clear benefit of insight and
well, I think the hindsight here is actually pretty powerful, and I would say it was a major negative shock to supply. I'm going to talk in like Econ 101 terms here. I'm not going to get into all the details, but basically, aggregate supply in our economy, the ability of our economy to employ and produce, shifted to the left, and demand shifted to the right, and because of fiscal policy and monetary policy, response to the pandemic, and also the really rapid kind of return of the economy, like in the United States, where we had this shutdown of the economy, but it bounced back pretty strongly, and a lot of demand for especially goods, as people were working remotely or living, and not going to the office and going into restaurants and things like that. So I think it was both. I think, later on we were, I'll speak for myself, recognizing this, with supply cut back because of the pandemic and all the effects that had on trade and supplies, that clearly was important, and the demand would increase. And so then you really saw it in the supply chain bottlenecks. I mean, all the pictures of ships backed up. You talk to businesses, we can't get things. Delivery times were really extended and things. So if you think about a lot of these supply chain bottlenecks kind of measures, they really are a measure of the gap between demand and supply, right? And because demand is exceeding supply. So we saw a very rapid development of bottlenecks around the world. Clearly, we saw labor demand exceed supply for, I think, for both these reasons. So in how to quantify that, I think both of those were important, and I think we see that on the return trip. I just described inflation in a recent speech as sending a person to the moon and bringing them back home safely, and that's what we want to do with inflation, is bring it back. And so on the return trip, I think we're seeing the exact same dynamics. Supply is shifting out, labor supply is shifting out, supply chain bottlenecks are resolving, and demand is shifting. We could get into this right. I think demand is shifting back, but partly because monetary policy went from being extremely expansionary to being restrictive. So I think both of these are important. I think depending on your analysis, I'm not sure how to assign different shares, but again, in retrospect, the imbalance between demand and supply showed up, and prices and wages rising significantly.
You just brought up the hiking, so let's go 1 year forward. We went with the inflation going up 2021, 2022. And 3, we had the fastest hiking in monetary policy, or in interest rates, using it as a measure of monetary policy in many decades. Yeah. We now see inflation going down. Some of my colleagues and theorists would say those two are unconnected. We'll say some other reasons why it went down. It strikes me as implausible.
I think
there's a connection between those two. But going back to that connection, what did you learn from this experience? Because as scientists, as a policymaker, you hate variability. Your job is to stop it. As a scientist, I love variability. It allows me to learn a little bit. So when you've hiked this high, I think we've learned something about the transmission mechanism of monetary policy. And so what have you learned about the transmission mechanism of monetary policy that you would connect to academics in terms of how is it that this hike transmitted into the fall in inflation?
I'm going to dangerously fall in the trap of saying that a lot of this is what I learned in grad school, because I think there are important principles that are applied to that situation. And I think, really think these are important. One is expectations matters a lot. It's not just about the Fed, raising or cutting interest, the Fed funds rate, by a certain amount. It's really about the confidence and expectations that households and businesses and financial markets have about what's going to happen in the future. And again, doing this looking back, it was clear that there were signs of using the New York Fed survey of consumer expectations, like the 3-year ahead inflation expectations were moving up in 2021. We were seeing signs that was happening. The 1 year ahead moved up, and I know you study this a lot, but it can be very sensitive to inflation. But we were seeing some signs of more medium term inflation expectations moving. Obviously, we were seeing wage and price inflation pick up. So I go back to how do I think about monetary policy in this? First of all, I think there are 3 things. One is we learn from history, we learn from experience that the central bank, in our case, the Fed, is accountable and has ownership to make sure to ensure price stability. We're not going to look to somebody else to do it. And the debates in the 70s and things of pointing fingers and oil shocks and this, we don't, we're not doing that. We have a 2% inflation goal. We've set that. We've committed to that. And it's a very difficult, challenging circumstances, but we are absolutely committed to price stability. Chair Powell's speech at Jackson Hole just made that absolutely clear that we were going to make sure we got that done. So I think that's an important thing. Maybe, it kind of gets to the question that some people ask, well, maybe the central banks, they'll allow inflation to stay high. Well, we just said that's not an option. 2 was the inflation expectations, which I mentioned, and that's an important indicator of what's happening, and it's something we need to have well anchored. So, to me, I think that's a powerful channel of monetary policy, but I think it's a powerful indicator of what's happening. And the third is, as you point out, is you have to back up all of that words and everything with action. I think that the need to move very quickly and forcefully was completely appropriate. I obviously support that 100%, but I also think it reinforced the message that we were taking strong action to achieve these goals. So I go back to things like the Taylor Principle, or going back to Milton Friedman, or you go back to whatever history is really the key kind of lessons of the importance of us to own, the price stability, to really focus on inflation expectations and anchoring those and maintaining the anchor and taking the actions that are necessary. In terms of the channels of monetary policy, I think it kind of worked more the way we would expect, at least in the U.S. Clearly, there was strong transmission to financial conditions. When we were raising, when we started signaling that we were, moving to tighten policy, market expectations shifted. We saw that show up in, real, financial conditions that matter, like mortgage rates and things. And I think that's been an important driver of, I guess it's moving along the IS curve is the right way to say it, but bringing demand back closer to supply. And now in the U.S. context, that's part of the job. The other part of the job was we've seen a recovery of supply, and the two coming together, coming back towards each other.
So we've made it all the way to the present when it comes to inflation. Inflation is now coming down. Maybe faster, maybe slower, the data will say, and let's see what monetary policy is adequate. I won't ask you about that, but I'll ask you instead, go back to your point of often you're using the working papers written by my esteemed colleagues here. What are the working papers in the next 6 months, as you grappling with questions now, that you would like to see in terms of topics? What are the things that you think will be helpful in the next stage that you're entering now?
So I've got this fantastic group of research economists at the New York Fed, and great colleagues around the Federal Reserve System and the central bank community around the world. And we're all thinking about those issues. But I will tell you the issue that I have thought a lot about that question. I think understanding the price wage dynamics in this context right now is still a big open question. Before I'm going to kind of describe how some people would talk about the Phillips curve, when we had very low inflation, before the pandemic, right? A decade of below 2% inflation. People talked about a flat Phillips curve. They talked about inflation expectations, just completely anchored or, maybe slipping slightly to lower. And now we've seen this, very rapid movement in inflation up and then down. We've seen it on wages. We've seen it in a lot of different countries. And is there something different about inflation, wage and price dynamics because of the extraordinary circumstances, because of the shocks? Was it just the shocks? Or are these dynamics going to be with us? I mean, the classic thing is that I always ask is, if these are nonlinear dynamics or nonlinear Phillips curve, or whatever you call it, however you describe it, is that going to be the same on the way down, or is it some other process? And how do we think about this? So I'm with you completely in what you said. I didn't want the variability in the data. I want to see the variability in the inflation data to go away, and that's my job. However, I think for all the scientists, I'm saying we've now seen a lot of information that helps us think about this. Some of our economists in the New York Fed, for example, they've been looking at pass-through into import prices, and saw pass-through go up quite a bit, from cost to like producer prices during the pandemic period. And what's the theories and what's the evidence that we can understand? Are these dynamics unique to this period, or is this actually really informing us about how our prices and wages set? I know this is an issue you've thought about for decades, but it's like the last 15 years or 25 years or whatever, we haven't had a lot of, kind of data to inform us on that. Now, some great researchers have looked at the micro data, they've looked at a lot of stuff, but I would hope that we would learn a lot from this and try to understand kind of how this is going to play out going forward. There is the tendency to talk very loosely about, well, inflation is persistent or not persistent. Again, a topic you and I have talked about for a long time. But I think we also need to get past that. We need to understand, well, why would it be persistent or not, and how do these pieces fit together? Especially given we've seen inflation expectations come back down quite a bit. So that piece seems to we understand that, and now, how do we think about this kind of question of, is inflation persistent? I mean, if you go back to your new Keynesian model, inflation isn't persistent at all. You can add things to that model to make it more persistent, but it's hard to get it really persistent. So anyway, I think these are the kind of things that I would hope we'd be help kind of research that will help policymakers over not just over the next 6 months, but over the next couple of years.
Well, I was going to go
but
beyond.
I need it sooner, right? So as soon
Exactly.
as possible.
But even beyond the next 6 months. So the Bank of England right now, and this has been a little bit of the public debate here, has been about reassessing the role of models in the bank or how to revise the model. Ben Bernanke, another common friend, came in and he's about to, I think, publish a review of the way the models are used at the Bank of England, what models should be used or not. You already mentioned that DSG is not a four-letter word for you.
No.
But could you give us a little bit of that perspective beyond just the next 3 months, but even over the next 3-4 years, with what you've learned, what you think are the role of models within a central bank? How can they be used? Not just whether they should be used or not, but especially how can they be used? What do you think is the most fruitful way in which they build it? Again, because as we connect academics to policies, that will influence the kind of models that we work on.
Yeah. So first of all, I've always think that models are very helpful to communicate ideas, organize your thoughts, and also organize the data. Because once you write down a model, it is helping you think about what are the data that are going to inform whether that model is supported by the data or contradicted, or what the parameters are. And then, we can have a very good conversation among researchers and policymakers about that. So I think models are very important. I personally like models so much that I like having lots of models. In central banks, some of the criticisms, the Fed's model or some other central bank's model. I said, well, in fact, all of us use lots of different models. Our researchers use lots of different things, from relatively simple reduced form econometric models up to very complex general equilibrium models and everything in between. And I think that's the right answer to the question of models. We want to use lots of them. We want to understand, sometimes if you're trying to understand something about productivity or innovation, you're going to use a model that's really focused on that part of it and not trying to get every aspect of price and wage dynamics right. If you're looking at other issues, you want to do other things. Yeah, I have a story, and I like to tell because it does tie into my LSE experience and my life experience. I remember, so this is it was a conversation with Lars Svensson years ago, and I think he was still at Princeton at the time. But I was telling Lars about my education background in economics, and I said that that I went to LSE and learned there. Then I went to Stanford and then had all these professors and and a wide range of things, everything from Joe Stiglitz, John Taylor, and Tom Sargent and Bob Hall and everybody. And Lars looked at me and said, boy, that's a hard way to learn a topic. And, because you're getting such a wide range of views, different perspectives. Stiglitz has always felt the mainstream macro doesn't get it right. And then, of course, Bob Hall and John Taylor kind of represent in many ways mainstream macro. And the thing that he said to me, though, that I've always held on to is, but if you can survive that, or if you can succeed with that, you would just have an amazing start to thinking, to your career and thinking about economics, because you're bringing this wide range of views. You're thinking about things differently. And sometimes you're thinking about, one of my mentors, my main mentor, outside of, my education was Janet Yellen. And she was, taught by Jim Tobin at Yale, and obviously all the people that Janet worked with in her illustrious career. And you learn from all these people, and they all have different ways of thinking about it. And there's some commonalities here. We believe in kind of economics. We believe in supply and demand and incentives matter and things, but understanding, like Joe Stiglitz would say, or Jim Tobin would say, financial frictions have always been important. We shouldn't have abandoned those. And others who say, but we've learned a lot looking at it this other way too. And like John Taylor, looking at things about like understanding what the most important principles of monetary policy. So I think getting that richness of the models and somehow being comfortable with the ambiguity, but also kind of, taking advantage of the ones that are going to help you think through a situation like this. I mean, you think about the any kind of thing that, like I gave the example of we're trying to understand the pandemic. I mean, you wanted to look at that and try to understand. In the end, I felt like, well, it didn't really teach us a lot, but you wanted to at least understand. Maybe the most important question you have as a policymaker is, after you discuss it with all the economists, is, I don't actually know this. And uncertainty is a very important concept in monetary policy, because you want to recognize what do you understand, but what are the things that are really uncertain, and then hopefully make decisions that aren't hinging on understanding this.
But now, within all of those models, you also need a framework. Yeah. And the Fed, I think, with a lot of bad luck, did a revision to its framework when it introduced the flexible average inflation targeting. Sorry, that was the name, back in 2020. A little bit unfortunate because, of course, you had to prepare this and the whole world kind of was changing. So in terms of the timing, it may not have been ideal. What that does mean, though, is that the Fed will probably be doing some revision of the framework at some point the next 1 to 5 years. Let's leave it vague enough. But at some point, there will have to be some revision of the framework in some kind. What do you think will be some of the important things for the new framework going forward?
Well, I'm not going to... So we are going to revisit the framework. We said that we would do a review every 5 or so years, and Chair Powell has made that clear in public comments. I'm not going to front run that discussion. That's going to be a committee discussion. We'll think about that, but I will go back to some of the lessons that I've experienced over the past 4 years. So first of all, I go back to, and it was in our 2012. That was in 2012 is when the FOMC first had a 2% inflation target. So, and I was on the committee then too. So, whether 2012 or every year since, including, the revision to the framework, we have steadfastly held to the view that it is our responsibility to achieve maximum employment and price stability, or dual mandate goals. But price stability is really critical for its foundation for a successful and stable economy. So I think that's absolutely a bedrock principle. We tie the 2% inflation to well-anchored inflation expectations, because I think that's a very important thing. So I think some of the lessons of the last few years are just reinforcing things that have always been in the framework about the importance of having the 2% target, anchoring inflation expectations, and recognizing that we have the dual mandate goals and how we manage to that. So to me, I guess, without trying to figure out, everything but specific about that, I think those fundamental principles, we knew them before, we had put them in there. And now I just actually feel if I can say this, or even like in sports, they say give 110%. They're 110% true now, and I think that's the most important thing.
And then finally, before I start opening it up, just going to some things that you've worked on, John. One of the important contributions.
Took you a while to get. We could do R-star, I hope.
That's literally where I was going. So you've worked quite a bit on with a famous model of trying to measure where R-star is, with a statistical measure of roughly using past data and others. We're getting to there's certainly a lot of debates of where it will be using different kinds of approaches, different kinds of models. What are your updated views of where that is and how to think about it, and where would the R-star go?
Yeah, so R-star, the neutral interest rate or natural rate of interest, conceptually is the real interest rate, and here we think of the short-term interest rate, that would occur when the economy is kind of at full employment or in kind of steady state and growing at potential with low inflation. So it's a theoretical concept of an equilibrium condition in real interest rate in your model once all the shocks, the transitory shocks, wear off. Of course, in the real world, wow, I just put a whole bunch of things on that. You're in the shocks have worn off, you're in a steady state and things, and the steady state itself may be changing over time because the neutral rate may change because of changes in demographics or productivity or other factors that potentially affect the neutral rate. So our statistics. So I think that there's two ways. There's definitely multiple ways to think about this. There's obviously, you can do this in a very kind of well-specified model, like a DSG model. My colleagues at the New York Fed have done that. Other people have done that. And what Thomas Laubach and then Catherine Holson and Thomas and I worked on was let's just use the Kalman filter, my favorite statistical technique in the world, and try to infer just from the data, GDP, inflation, and interest rates, what is the, if you will, what's the I1 or kind of, what's the neutral interest rate, and allowing it to be time varying, and what's your best estimate of that? It's basically trying to get a time varying intercept in your VAR, a vector autoregression model, and get your best estimate using the Kalman filter. Now you have to make a bunch of assumptions and things like that, and as like any of our models, the assumptions will affect the results. But what we found, I think the two most, profound things that kind of came out of that, and we learned it after we wrote the paper. It's one of these things that 10 years later you go, wow, okay, this models is actually telling us something we weren't expecting. Is that after the financial crisis and quite honestly over a period, we saw these neutral interest rate estimates for the U.S. and other countries come down a lot. And then during the pandemic, we saw them move up a bit as inflation was high. Clearly output was growing rapidly during the recovery, and interest rates were high. And now we've seen them come back down to about the levels they were before the pandemic. So for the U.S., it's about 0.75 of a percentage point real interest rate. If you have 2% inflation, that'd be a 2 3/4% neutral Fed funds rate. For Europe, it's actually a little bit lower. Okay, so that's just looking backwards. That's looking at the data. The big question that people love to talk about is, what does the future hold? Well, if you think about economic theory, which I've learned a lot from other people thinking about this, it's about demographics, it's about productivity trends, it's about the demand for government securities versus other securities, often called, kind of a convenience yield or something like that. It's about a lot of those things. And it's about, as Ben Bernanke kind of famously described it back in, 2005 or 6, it's a global savings glut. It's really about the imbalance, or how does the balance of global savings and investment, and what price does that occur? You can think of it that way. And so the big question is demand for investment gone up or down? Is the supply of savings gone up or down? And I think the answer is, I don't know. Everyone brings up AI, and my answer to AI is, I don't know. Will AI create a productivity boom that will lead to an investment boom that would cause the natural rate of interest to go up? That could happen. We saw that in our model when we estimated that during the productivity boom of the mid-90s, early 2000s in the U.S., our estimates of R-star went up quite a bit. So that's plausible. Will the investment boom around, or policies around climate or deglobalization, could they affect savings and investment in one way or another? Possible. We haven't seen it yet. Directionally, I think that our theory tells us how to think about it, but we're going to have to watch and see what happens with the data. I will go back and say that the demographic waves that have been pushing, people have argued, it's not my research, but other research it pushes the neutral rate down. Those demographics are still moving in that direction. Mm-hmm. There's the productivity growth in the U.S., over the last 4 years has been basically what it was in the period before, the decade or so before. Maybe AI will create a new productivity wave, but we haven't yet seen that. And then there's the question I know that you've brought up a number of times, as have others, is this convenience yield, or how do we think about that? And the real interest rate for treasury securities versus what's the actual cost of capital, and does that change? And again, so far haven't seen a big movement in that, but that is something that could change in the future. So right now, my view is, based on what we actually have, the neutral rate is still quite low. But one of the things I like about the model is, if the data tells you something else, it's not like it's a view I have based on my own preferences. It's just what the model's saying. And like I said, during the time when a lot of people were saying R-star could be higher, our estimates were actually moving up, and then they've come down as inflation's come down.
I should open this, but I want to push a little bit just on that in something that let's go a little nerdier, if you want, on this.
Even nerdier,
which is that there's 3 concepts of R-star floating around.
Okay.
One you've mentioned is the trend.
Yeah.
And so this will be some long-run equilibrium, steady state, and whatnot. And then the statistical filter, like yours, is kind of just clear the right way to get a trend. Then there's a model-based R-star, which is whatever clear savings and investments after frictions are gone or not, which can coincide with the trends if you have a particular, say, New Keynesian view of the world, but doesn't have to per se. I mean, that could be very volatile. Indeed, sometimes in the New Keynesian literature, that's called the Vixelian rate, that moves around a lot. Actually, And then there's, of course, a third R-star, which be the R-star such that if I add 2%, if interest rates are above or below, we're in restrictive range, that's more policy speak, or in non-restricting speak. These 3 R-stars get mumbled all the time, but as you immediately already just said, they don't have to be the same. The Vixelian one, the restrictive one, and the trend one can all be very different. how would you square the fact that we have these three R stars? They all have the same name. Maybe they should just have different names. And they're kind of informing you about different things, but they're all, again, in the models I write, in the steady state, in the long run, all three are the same.
Yeah.
But at any kind of reasonable horizon, they're actually very, very different.
Yeah. So I've obviously been asked that a lot, even from when Thomas and I were originally working on this back in the 90s. Sometimes it's called either the Vexellian or the kind of Woodfordian kind of thing, short run R star. So I find that it's really, those are mappings of the shocks into the interest rate that achieves something. Mm-hmm. So if you think about the very short one, if you go back to Mike Woodford's book or any of this, and people have actually done estimates of that, and that's how we it's not how we started, but we were looking at that too. And of course, it's extremely volatile because it's asking period by period, say what clears the market, or what creates inflation to be 0 or 2% or whatever it is. And that is a mapping. And I have a paper where I did also with Rochelle Edge, and where we did that mapping. And it's just a mapping of the shocks. If you assume the long run R-star is constant, this is just a mapping of the shock. So I guess I'm a student of John Taylor's. I kind of like the concept of conceptually to think about things as a reaction function or a Taylor rule. And the response to the shocks is represented perhaps by the response to inflation and the output gap or other variables you put in your rule. That's capturing the shorter business cycle fluctuations, and this R star is the longer term. So I don't think it's a confusion. I think these different concepts, they're sensible, they're logical. We just need to be clear. So if you're doing a Taylor rule kind of calculation, you don't want to have a high a kind of a Vexellian kind of R star or something like that, and have a reaction to the other things. So you just need to be clear what it is. Now, personally, I think that the short run R stars can be very sensitive to the model, sensitive to things like that. And I kind of not focus on that, focus more on the longer run, kind of the intercept of the Taylor rule kind of thing. But I have tried over, God, how many years, and we're up to like almost 25 years, to try to get us to focus on not confusing the language, but these concepts all make sense. And by the way, you go back originally to Vexel, or you go to, there's this economist John H. Williams, not related to me, who was at Harvard and actually advised the New York Fed back in the 40s, a very kind of funny 30s actually, 30s and 40s. But they had this idea of a Vexellian idea, which was really just if prices are going up, then the interest rate must be lower than the neutral rate. If prices are going down, it must be higher. I mean, it's as simple as that. And I sometimes think, that's kind of maybe at the root of how we're thinking about things in terms of this restrictive policy. But these ideas, as you know, have been around for over 100 years. They're, I think, powerful ideas, and the challenge we all have as empirical economists is not so much understanding them, but how do you bring the data to bear on them?
Very good. I'm going to open to the floor. If you could put your hand up, I'll call on you, and I'll collect like 3 questions and go to you, and we'll do how many rounds of 2 or 3 questions that we can get. Okay. So let me look at both sides, but I'll start there. And just say, if you don't mind, just saying your name and your position, affiliation, whatnot. Just
sure. Thank you. It was a very interesting conversation. Michael Cabral from the School of Public Policy, and I've written down my questions, so I'm just going to read it. As we know, the independence of the central bank is very important. Raising rates is generally unpopular. So how do you handle political pressure on the Fed, and what recommendations would you give monetary policymakers in other countries facing political pressure from lawmakers?
Then I'll ask, let me just ask 2 and then. Oh, it was you, sorry. The lady over there.
Yeah, thank you very much for your insights. So I wanted to ask, how do you decide whether to accommodate a supply shock or not? So I've only just started learning this, but from what I understand, it sounds like a dilemma where if aggregate demand increases, then the negative output gap could decrease, but inflation will increase. And then it could be the other side around. If AD decreases, and inflation will decrease, but the negative output gap will be worse. So how do you navigate this dilemma? Yeah, thank you.
All right, great questions. So on the political question, I mean, central banks like the Fed and many around the world have been given, I think, the independence to take the actions to carry out the goals that the governments have set out. For us, we have our maximum employment price stability goals, which are set, in law by Congress and the Federal Reserve Act, and it's our job to use the tools that also the law allows us to use to carry that out. And I think there's as we saw over the last four years, and over the last 2 years, I should say, there's nobody who thinks high inflation is a good thing. If you ever had a debate among academics what the optimal rate of inflation is, a high number. Well, let me tell you, it is not a high number. People feel inflation pain, especially a lot of people with lower or moderate income. People don't have the ability through other savings or financial market kind of ways to protect themselves against inflation. So I from my perspective, the ability to take strong actions and really make sure that we restore price stability is it's not something that there's a political debate about whether we should be restoring price stability. This is something that there's a very strong consensus about. In terms of the actual actions, we just focus 100% on doing our job and doing the very best we can. Politics doesn't get into it. We don't talk about politics. We talk about, if you read the transcripts of FOMC meetings, which are available, they are extraordinarily dry discussions of the economy, models, all the things. So everything's there. And I think that's the best way to preserve the independence, deliver the outcomes that benefit society, and do it in a nonpartisan way. Now, in terms of this accommodating supply shocks, it's a great question because you would think about monetary policy, you are always trying to achieve your goals of the economy being kind of strong and inflation or near the target, but you're being kind of hit by various supply and demand shocks. And I think that the issue is always to think about how does the shock affect your two objectives. So a big demand shock, positive demand shock, might cause employment to get stronger, but inflation to get higher. And so it's kind of clear that you want to offset that. Supply shocks may affect your goals in different directions, like sometimes an oil price shock, or it might cause inflation to go up, but unemployment to go up. And it's weighing those objectives and also the time dimension of them. Sometimes these shocks don't last that long. In monetary policy, this is debated, but monetary policy, we tend to think, takes a year or more to have its full effect on the economy. So you don't want to be over responding to temporary shocks. You really want to me, be anchoring inflation, keeping inflation near 2% as best you can, but not trying to over kind of react to short-term things. So there's no ironclad rule. I often go back to the empirical evidence on this, and that some shocks, historically, we've seen kind of have offsetting effects on the U.S. economies, like oil price shocks. What's interesting is the U.S. economy has changed in the last 50 years. It used to be that we were such huge importers of oil that when we had an oil price shock, it was negative for income, and it created higher inflation. Today, we're basically more neutral on the oil supply, and so its effects on income, national income or less. And it has more inflation. So you have to kind of also recognize that these trade-offs that you're dealing with are different. The fact is, though, I go back to this uncertainty. We never really know whether shocks are supply or demand or other things or other categories. And you're just trying to, focus on getting the economy to the where you want it to be.
We go to this side now. Question here.
Good afternoon, Brunello Rosa and Rubini Associates and Center for Macroeconomics. A couple of questions. At the beginning of the tightening cycle, you were hoping to achieve a soft landing, but actually the economy is surprised on the upside, and perhaps there's no landing. So is there anything that you might have missed in your analysis at the beginning, or perhaps the models, as you suggested, were not appropriate? That's the first question. Second question is, clearly, the feature of this period is geopolitical risk. How do you factor that in your decision-making process? Thank you.
What?
The geopolitical risk.
Yeah.
Go for it. There were two questions there.
Okay. So on the geopolitical risk, let me do that first and then come back to the other. I mean, we're in a global economy. Obviously, Britain's in a global economy. We're all in a global economy, and we're a global financial system. And the U.S.'s, financial system is very tightly connected to the rest of the world. And so when you think about geopolitical risks, whether events or wars or other things are happening, it's kind of think about similar to how we think about how is China going to evolve over the next couple of years? Are they going to grow, close to their 5% target? How are they going to do that? Or are they not? And how is that affecting? So it's really about looking at how these developments affect the outlook for the economy. Inflation, commodity prices is a big factor. Flight to safety can be a part of that. Global investors moving to U.S. treasuries. So really trying to understand the dynamics of those developments and how they affect financial conditions in the U.S. and our economy, and obviously financial conditions and the global economy, and how it feeds back. And then I think most importantly, it's in the scenario analysis, the risks that we do every FOMC round. We look at lots of what happens if, and try to take that into account. Not because we don't know how these things will play out, but then we've at least thought through kind of where are the balance of risks, or kind of how do you think positioning policy appropriately for kind of from a risk management point of view. We all study linear quadratic models, and we know that uncertainty doesn't matter in linear quadratic models. Well, the world isn't a linear quadratic model, and you do want to think about how the uncertainties and risks play into thinking about whether there's asymmetry in the risk or particular risks that you want to manage. And your first question, just what was the? Yeah. Well, it's something we miss. Again, I don't blame models. I think that models are the way we communicate. They're the ways we write down our ideas and the way we communicate our ideas. So if models are no good, then the economists haven't gotten it right. So we should all own that. I think that if you look at the U.S. economy last year, it's kind of remarkable at a macro point of view. GDP growth was more than 3%. Most estimates of trend are somewhere around 1.75% to 2%. So way above trend output, when most or many private sector forecasters just 12, 14 months ago were predicting a high probability of a recession. Okay, so we went from going to have a recession to over 3% growth. Unemployment is 3.7%. It actually moved up a little bit, okay, with 3% growth. So now I'm doing my supply demand. I'm getting a little confused. What's going on here? I got really strong demand, unemployment going up. All the measures that we look at, and we look at lots of them, is the labor market getting more tight or less tight? We're saying it was getting less tight. Job openings, job vacancies were coming down, quits rates were coming down. A lot of things we're saying, hey, the labor market the tightness is receding, not gone, but receding, and inflation came down, and wage inflation's come down some. So what is it? Well, okay, so Econ 101, demand was strong, prices came down, unemployment went up. Supply was extraordinarily strong in 2023. So I think three things. One of it was some of it's productivity, clearly. I think most of that's cyclical, but productivity growth was good. The labor force grew clearly a lot. Some of that's labor force participation. During the pandemic, labor force participation plummeted. It is now, at least for the 25 to 54-year-old group, which I call the very young, that group is now back to more or less where it was. We've seen some loss of participation from older cohorts. And the big story here is immigration. Big increase in labor supply in the U.S., either through people coming into the country to work or through visa holders similarly, which during the pandemic, we saw that dry up a lot because of the pandemic and other reasons, and now is bringing more labor supply. So we've got a big positive. As a monetary policy maker, what do you like the most? Positive supply shocks. They're good. They're good for the economy. They're good for your goals. Whether that can continue, I think what we're seeing in the U.S. is labor supply is still coming in pretty strong. So maybe that will continue. Maybe the productivity growth might continue. I don't know. But I think that's the big story. So did our models get that wrong? I think no. I don't think that's a model story. That's not a theory story. It's actually a data story. And you just go back to policy making in the real world. You gotta be Bayesian. You got an idea of what's going on. You get the information. You adjust that. You update your prior, and you keep doing that. And we did that on inflation. We didn't, dwell on that, but we updated our priors as the data came in and acted accordingly. And I think similarly with some of the labor force.
I had a question two questions here, Luis and then Martin.
Thank you, Ricardo. Very interesting, John. Thank you. So the other remarkable thing of the last couple of years after the rates increased was the financial stability observation, right? So with interest rates so low, one would have expected a huge sensitivity to policy rates of all the asset prices, all the collateral, big financial repercussions of these big moves. Nothing happened. Okay, we had Silicon Valley Bank. Yes, you would probably say the banks, we had done a lot of homework during the 2010s, but also all the shadow banking, all the private debt, all of those things did not happen. Another dog that didn't bark. So what is the explanation for that one in your view? And how surprised were you? I would have made a serious bet 2 years ago, which I would have lost a lot of money, that these would not go without blood in the streets from a financial stability perspective.
Martin, can you grab the mic?
Thanks so much for the discussion. The models that you've used to describe the effect of monetary policy have a very strong distinction between the short run economy and the long run economy. And one question that's come up in Europe is that with the rise of policy rates in the middle of a transition, for example, to cleaner production, may well be that the current hikes in interest rates are actually hurting green innovation. Right? Is that something that you're concerned about, or more generally, should monetary policymakers care about the long run effects of their interventions?
So the question about, I guess the way I think about your question, let's start with the first one, is, we raised rates very rapidly with 75 basis point hike, which we hadn't done since the early mid-90s. We acted very forcefully to do that. And there were very, very much, it's very true what you're saying. There were concerns about would there be some fragilities, either known fragilities or unknown fragilities that would manifest themselves during that. And it's not just in the United States, of course. Other countries were doing similar things. Going into this, we know that liquidity in the U.S. Treasury market is far lower than it used to be. Depth of the market is less and things like that. And we know that, in the U.S. especially, and here too, non-bank financial institutions, play a much bigger role, and there's hidden leverage. And we've seen that pop up, and here in the UK, we've seen it pop up in the US, and we saw it very, very, very live in spring of 2020. So I don't get to, I wouldn't make bets on anything because it would be against the rules, but I will say that we were watching very carefully whether fragilities in core markets, treasury markets, money markets showed up in that, and also where the hidden leverage could show up. You're right, though. In the end of the day, besides some of these issues at the regional banks, the overall financial stability ended up, not being the problem. And I think very importantly, we were able to take the monetary policy actions needed to restore price stability unconstrained by concerns around financial stability, partly because when the bank's issues happened a year ago with Silicon Valley Bank, we were able to do exactly what you want to do in the textbook. You apply liquidity policies, you apply resolution solutions to address those very narrowly. And we did that with discount window kind of programs. The regulatory agencies dealt with the institutions that were in trouble, and leaving monetary policy the room to maneuver. And like you said, we didn't see other issues. I will say in the banking system, of course, as you pointed out, the reforms of the previous decade were an important part of making sure that the banking system was stronger. So on the second question was long run effects. This is an issue that comes up a lot. I guess I am a little old fashioned here, so I'll start with my maybe my prior and then answer your question. So my prior is that monetary policy, cyclical monetary policy decisions, the movement up and down relative to the neutral rate has, I think, relatively small or no effects on long run equilibrium conditions in the economy. However, so I think I do have the separation idea. The long run equilibrium conditions are determined by fundamental factors of investment and saving and a lot of other things. But then your point is, yes, there can be a relationship between the fact that we had high inflation, therefore high real interest rates from the responsive policy to the high inflation, and that's affects investment. So there is, in a rich model of investment and interest rates, there's going to be a secondary kind of effect of investment, presumably productivity, but also you brought up the example of, I think, climate, investments that will, have lasting effects. So I think if you have, going back to like my education, if you have a good, strong, thinking about there's there's I still call it RBC, but there's a fundamental model behind the scenes, and then we're superimposing some, short-term dynamics on top of that. I think there are some connections there. For my kind of monetary policy lens that I look at this, the most important thing we can do for the long run issues is restore, have price stability and economic and financial stability. Those are the foundations that will serve us, for everything. But, I think that this is an area where some of our modeling, okay, I'm going to sound like I'm blaming the SG models, but I'm not blaming them. But some of the very, very tight focus on short-term, temporary dynamics and losing the capital stocks and kind of thinking about how that plays out, probably maybe is missing some of those interactions.
Fantastic. We're at 1 o'clock sharp and you have a tight schedule. So let's just thank John for joining. Now we have